Hey everyone, Brandon here from TruckSafe. In other videos, we've hit on the importance of thorough driver qualification. Missteps in that qualification process regularly contribute to high CSA scores, downgraded safety ratings, and nuclear verdicts, just to name a few. Now, Part 391 of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations and related state rules lay out the steps that regulated carriers must follow when qualifying new drivers. But what about drivers who work for multiple carriers or employers, or those who will only be temporarily operating for them? Are the rules different in that context? That's what we're discussing in this video, so stay tuned and do us a favor by hitting those like and subscribe buttons below. All right, before diving right into the regulatory nuances for multiple employer drivers and temporary drivers, it's important that we first have a good handle on the normal single employer driver qualification process. Now, we've broken this process down in detail in other videos and some of the articles we've published, but generally speaking, it involves first ensuring that driver candidates meet the minimum qualification standards in Section 391.11 of the safety regulations. Things like being at least 21 years old, holding a valid and appropriate license, and being able to read and speak English sufficiently. Beyond that, the normal process requires the driver applicant to complete a detailed driver application and the prospective carrier to run various background checks, including things like a motor vehicle report, previous employer verifications of employment, and clearinghouse checks, just to name a few. Now, these prospective carriers also have to gather specific qualification-related documentation from the driver applicants, like copies of their med cards, their licenses or CDLs, etc. Simply put, there's quite a lot that goes into the full driver qualification process. So what about the process is different for drivers that work for multiple employers or for temporary drivers? Well, let's start first with multiple employer drivers. As many know, it's fairly common in this industry for regulated drivers to work for multiple carriers at a time, particularly in certain segments like drive-away, tow-away. It also regularly arises in situations where a large motor carrier operates through several separate but related subsidiaries and transfers drivers among them. Imagine this example. Driver John Doe currently works for carrier ABC Trucking, but is also looking to operate for carrier XYZ Trucking during his downtime. John is already fully qualified by ABC Trucking and is now applying to work for XYZ Trucking. How, if at all, does the qualification process differ in this context from the norm? As a preliminary matter, it's important to know that it is certainly XYZ Trucking's prerogative to fully qualify John in this context, like it would do for a single employer driver. Many carriers do just that, and it's usually advisable to do so. Now, with that said, the regulations do offer an alternative, which can shortcut the typical qualification process for multiple employer drivers, thus saving some time and effort on the part of the second or subsequent employing motor carrier. 49 CFR Section 391.63, which is titled Multiple Employer Drivers, says that if a motor carrier employs a person as a multiple employer driver, as that term is defined in the regulations, the motor carrier shall comply with all of the normal qualification requirements except the application requirement, the motor vehicle report, and previous employer verification of employment requirements, and the annual review process. So let's break this down. First of all, how do the regulations define a multiple employer driver? Well, Section 390.5 defines it as a driver who, in any period of 7 consecutive days, is employed or used as a driver by more than one motor carrier. So in more simple terms, Section 391.63 allows a motor carrier to short-circuit some of the typical qualification-related administrative tasks, the application, verifications of employment, that type of stuff, for driver applicants who qualify as multiple employer drivers, meaning those who work for 2 or more regulated motor carriers simultaneously in a 7-day period. What does it mean to work for 2 or more carriers in a 7-day period? Well, it means that a driver only qualifies for this exemption if they physically work for more than one carrier in a given week. If, on the other hand, they perform work for only a single carrier in a given week, then they become a single employer driver of that carrier, and the multiple employer driver exemption no longer applies. So in short, this exemption is limited to drivers who physically perform services for more than one carrier in a given week. If instead they work for only one carrier in a given week, then that carrier is responsible for fully qualifying that driver. Now, assuming a particular driver does qualify for the multiple employer driver exemption, then the regulations go on to say that before a motor carrier permits a multiple employer driver to drive a commercial motor vehicle, that motor carrier must obtain the driver's name, social security number, and the identification number, type, and issuing driver's licensing authority of the driver's commercial motor vehicle operator's license. That carrier must also maintain this information for at least 3 years after employment of that multiple employer driver ceases. Okay, so moving on to temporary drivers. The regulations offer a similar exemption for drivers who only temporarily work for a particular carrier. For example, if a driver is transferred from carrier A to carrier B to fill in for just a few days, Carrier B may be able to take advantage of a separate regulatory exemption, this one contained at 49 CFR section 391.65. Now that regulation, titled Drivers Furnished by Other Motor Carriers, says that a motor carrier may employ a driver who is not a single employer driver of that motor carrier without complying with the generally applicable driver qualification file requirements in this part if, number one, the driver is a single employer driver for another motor carrier, and number two, that other motor carrier certifies that the driver is fully qualified to drive a commercial motor vehicle in a written statement which contains specific information, like the driver's name, employment date, med card expiration date, etc. That certificate must be signed by the driver's main employer motor carrier, as well as the driver. So in short, to qualify for this exemption, a driver must not be a single employer driver of the carrier for whom they intend to work. The regulations define a single employer driver as a driver who, in any period of 7 consecutive days, is employed or used as a driver solely by a single motor carrier. In other words, this particular exemption is available only for drivers who will drive for the prospective motor carrier 6 or fewer consecutive days at a time. If instead they're going to work for that carrier for 7 or more consecutive days at a time, they become that carrier's single employer driver and must be fully qualified by that carrier. So this exemption is limited to very short-term arrangements. Assuming it does apply, the employing motor carrier can short-circuit many of the standard qualification steps by accepting a certificate of qualification from that driver's typical employing motor carrier. Now, the content of that certificate is set out in section 391.65 of the regulations, and it must be kept by the subsequent employing carrier for the length of the driver's employment plus 3 years. Importantly, the regulation goes on to require the carrier who chooses to take advantage of this exemption to make contact with the driver's typical employing motor carrier to confirm the accuracy of the certificate. The reg also makes clear that a motor carrier which certifies a driver's qualifications under this section shall be responsible for the accuracy of the certificate, and the certificate is no longer valid if the driver leaves the employment of the motor carrier which issued the certificate to begin with, and is no longer qualified under the rules in that exemption. All right, so those are the multiple employer and temporary driver exemptions contained within Part 391 of the Federal Safety Regulations. Let's touch on a couple of other things to keep in mind when it comes to qualifying drivers who work for multiple carriers at any given time. First, per FMCSA guidance, the qualification certificate that's contemplated by the temporary driver regulation, again 391.65, can only be generated and issued by a regulated motor carrier. In other words, if a driver is employed by a non-regulated carrier, for example, a driver staffing agency, then the first regulated motor carrier that engages that driver to operate a commercial motor vehicle on its behalf must fully qualify that driver. Also, a slightly adjacent issue for consideration is hours of service compliance. Drivers who work for multiple carriers at a time are responsible for accurately recording their duty status and tracking their hours across all such carriers. Each carrier that engages the driver must ensure it has a full picture of the driver's available hours, meaning they must either obtain copies of the driver's logs from their other carrier or have the driver manually input time from that other carrier on their log. So that's going to wrap things up for this video. In sum, sections 391.63 and .65 of the Federal Safety Regulations offer some limited relief from the typical driver qualification process for carriers that hire multiple employer and or temporary drivers. Those exemptions are fairly limited in scope, so carriers must take care to ensure that drivers actually qualify for them. Additionally, the exemptions are not wholesale exemptions, meaning carriers who take advantage of them must still take some basic steps to ensure that the drivers are indeed qualified as outlined in the respective regulatory text. For even more in-depth information about these types of regulatory topics, Be sure to check out our innovative online compliance courses for safety managers and for drivers over at trucksafeacademy.com. Also, if you're looking for an easier way to access and understand the federal motor carrier safety regulations, be sure to check out eRegs, the first app-based digital version of the regulations over at eregs.app. Lastly, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter at trucksafe.com/subscribe and follow us on our various social media pages for the latest highway transportation news and analysis. Thanks for watching.